welcome back to another Doctor Who action figure product review on the Host Productions. In today's review I'm going to be taking a look at one of the most recent B&M exclusive collector sets as a part of the History of the Daleks series. This time round set 3, featuring 2 Dalek variations from the First Doctor 1965 serial, The Chase, including a silver and blue Dalek alongside the Chase Guard Dalek. This set, along with the other B&M exclusives, are available to purchase from in-store now. The recommended retail is £19.99. Firstly, taking a very quick look at the packaging, because let's face it, we are all used to this design by this point. At the top we get the Doctor Who logo, along with a graphic of the TARDIS, the title of the set at the very bottom, along with a preview window giving a good look at the 2 Daleks on the inside of the box. On one side of the box it does feature a continuation of the TARDIS graphic, and then flipping around to the top we basically have exactly the same details repeated, along with company information at the bottom. At the back of the box we get the same layout to usual, featuring 2 images of the Daleks on the inside of the box, as well as giving a little bit of a write-up and story synopsis about the story The Chase from 1965, as well as a little bit of information about the Dalek props themselves, and basically stating the design ideas from Ray Cusick back in the 1960s, and kind of showing the development of the Daleks through the various serials, and building up almost this historic archive of the different Dalek variations, especially when compared to the previous 2 sets released as a part of this series so far, good in chronological order from the very beginning. A really lovely touch, and once again really appealing to the collectors. To in keep with the style of the previous collector sets as a part of this series, of course the product does come with a unique backdrop representing a certain location from said Doctor Who serial. This time round we have the Jungles of Mechanus. Of course, if you have the Jungles of Mechanus collector set, this background will be fairly familiar. This time round it's a shrunken down version with of course the absence of the TARDIS in the corner, looking very nice and almost a bit cartoony. So here we have the 2 Chase Daleks out of the box. Now, my previous History of the Daleks collector set reviews have focused primarily on that comparison to the pre-existing character options Daleks that have been released that look very, very similar to these Daleks, and of course very much like the previous sets as a part of this series. Both of these Daleks have technically been released before. First off, we have a rather lovely silver and blue livery 60s Dalek that was of course initially released in the Chase collector set, alongside another identical Dalek and of course the Mechanoid, and then we have the Chase Guard Dalek, which funnily enough also looks like a Peter Cushing movie Dalek that was originally released in the Sound Effects Daleks range Wave 2 and has since gone on to become considerably rare. And of course most recently we did also get to see the release of the Jungles of Mechanus collector set, which again featured 2 Daleks very, very similar in colour scheme to this one. So starting off with the regular silver and blue Chase Dalek. Now this is a Dalek that didn't particularly grab my attention when this set was initially announced, because let's face it, a lot of 1960s Daleks look very, very similar, and we've already seen a lot of 1960s Daleks released. But that said, and you know what I'm going to say here, it's actually a lovely variant. Again, it's using those same colour styles that have been used on the previous History of the Daleks collector sets, and as a result it has a really lovely finish. Now, I'm not saying that this Dalek is essential by any means. It's not. If you have any of the other 60s Daleks from the Chase, they are very, very similar, and the paint application changes are partially not even that noticeable. But much like History of the Daleks set 1 and 2, the silver paint application on this Dalek has been upgraded to have a metallic sheen over the top, making it look less like plastic and more so like an actual Dalek from 1960s Doctor Who, especially when there is a black and white filter applied over the top. Overall, this is really lovely and generally sets this Dalek apart from some of the other rather similar Daleks on the shelf. So firstly, starting off at the very bottom of the Dalek, I'm not going to pretend that this is a brand new sculpt. No doubt you yourself have this exact sculpt on your shelf at least 7 million times already. Regular Dalek fender at the very bottom. As always, this has been sculpted in a black plastic, and I'm in fact rather surprised to see that this time round they decided to keep it a rather pristine condition, as opposed to the previous History of the Daleks collector sets, which have seen a wash applied over the top to give the impression of the Dalek prop being pushed around the studio and generally worn over time. Next up we move up to the Dalek skirt. As I've already mentioned, overall the base colour of this Dalek is absolutely lovely. It is a silvery metallic sheen. If you've got History of the Daleks set 1, you know exactly what to expect from this Dalek, as it is pretty much exactly the same shade. We have the inclusion of the hemispheres. Again, these look very, very similar to the vast majority of 1960s First Doctor Daleks that we've seen in the line already. However, from what I can tell, this is in fact an ever so slightly different shade of blue, this time round being a little bit bit darker. Move on to the midsection of the Dalek, which this time round has the inclusion of the solar slats and mesh for the first time within the history of the Daleks series, and the vast majority of Daleks from this point onwards will also include this sculpt, and regardless of how many times it has been released in the past, there is no denying this is a lovely piece of sculpting work. Inclusion of the slats running all the way around the Dalek. Of course these are rather smooth, however we do have the inclusion of the little rivets both at the bottom as well as the top to give the impression that these have actually been nailed onto the Dalek, and then in between this we also have the inclusion of the mesh itself. Again, a really lovely texture has been applied to this to really make it look like metal. Talking about the weaponry, something of which that no Dalek would be complete without, we have the inclusion of the regular 1960s gun, which as always features a lot of nice details, including different sections running around to the very top where the blaster piece is, and much like the previous Daleks released as a part of this series, the ball joint at the base has also been painted silver, the same of which applies to the manipulator arm. And speaking of the manipulator arm, if you've got Daleks before, you know exactly what to expect. We have the silver paint application on the vast majority of the stalk, and then we have the black paint application at the end to replicate the plunger. And with that, we now move on to what is arguably the most notable change for this Dalek, and something of which that also applies to the history of the Dalek set 4, as the base colour of the midsection has now been painted white, as opposed to the darker or lighter grey seen on some of the previously released classic series 1960s Daleks. And to be quite honest with you all, I really don't care. I think it looks alright. I know that a number of people have been arguing about the accuracy and if it looks like how the Daleks looked back in 1960s Doctor Who. Of course, 1960s Doctor Who was black and white, therefore it can be rather difficult to get the exact shades. That said, we've seen countless 60s Daleks by this point, and I don't particularly mind if it's TV accurate or not. I actually think that this inclusion of white really nicely divides up the silver. I think that overall these Daleks have been a bit too silver and grey in the past, and it is nice to have something in the middle that is just a bit different to make this Dalek stand out, and to be honest, I think it works well, regardless of if it's accurate or not. Finally, for detailing, we conclude with the top half of the Dalek. As always, the barrel section is pretty much exactly the same to usual. A nice series of silver paint taps in between, of course, this mesh detailing in the very middle. Much like the rest of the Dalek, the dome has, of course, been painted that lovely silvery metallic sheen. And then we have the inclusion of the rather unusual lights, which were first used on the Power of the Daleks sound effects Dalek a number of years ago. Again, I don't particularly mind this. Apparently, it is more accurate to what is seen within the story itself. This time round the colour has been changed. Of course, on the initial Power of the Daleks sound effects Dalek, this was a very vibrant yellow. This has now been toned down to be a rather milky, cloudy yellow, which I suppose again looks okay. And then, of course, to finish off, we have the inclusion of the Dalek eye stalk. Again, this has seen a number of subtle paint application changes. The discs are in fact now an ever so slightly lighter blue to some of the previous Daleks, and are of course the spaced out sculpt, as well as to in keep with the other history of the Daleks collector sets. Of course, the eye stalk tip has been given a base colour of black, but this time the iris has been made ever so slightly smaller, replicated using a pinprick of white paint application. So in conclusion for this Dalek, it's alright, it's decent, I don't mind it, it's exactly the same colour scheme pretty much to the vast majority of other 1960s Daleks, and if you have said Daleks, then you know exactly what to expect from this variant. It's certainly not essential by any means. The inclusion of the white midsection is alright. I think that I will say is the subtle paint application changes are overall quite nice. They look visually quite appealing, but that said, a Dalek is a Dalek, and if you've got other Daleks, this one isn't particularly that special, but the paint application is considerably sharp, especially on these hemispheres at the very bottom, with very little paint leak, so I suppose that is always a bonus. Next up, we have the Chase Guard Dalek, originally released as a part of the Sound Effects Daleks range Wave 2, and as I mentioned earlier, that Dalek has gone on to be very sought after by Doctor Who collectors, and as a result is considerably rare, so this set makes for a perfect opportunity to pick up a rather similar Dalek. But for those of you that do have that original Dalek, fear not, because this one does feature, you guessed it, some minor paint application changes. In fact, if you've got the very recent Jungles of Mechanus collector's set, which was exclusive to the Capture Options website, which has now sold out, again, you know exactly what to expect from this Dalek, because for the most part, the paint application and overall colour palette is generally identical. In fact, rather conveniently, here is the Jungles of Mechanus collector set for a comparison. For those of you that have seen that review, I said that I was thinking about getting a second set, and this is the second set. I'm thinking about keeping this one in the box. So across the entirety of my B&M 2020 October release reviews, this is in fact going to be the only comparison that I'm going to be able to do, because I have a Jungles of Mechanus set back at home at Hosty HQ, as well as up Newcastle as well, where I'm of course studying at university. So of course it doesn't take a genius to work out what the main differences are with these Daleks and that Dalek. Of course, as I mentioned, the colour palette is very, very similar. The first notable difference is that we now have the absence of the large bumper fender at the very bottom, which is of course a rather iconic piece of the Peter Cushing movie Daleks, or the Jungles of Mechanus Daleks as they are also known. And of course the other main difference is the giant jam jar ear dome lights are now removed entirely, and we have the more regular Doctor Who lights that we've just taken a look at with the previous Dalek within this set, which again are an ever so slightly cloudier shade of yellow compared to the previous releases. Very much like how I mentioned within the Jungles of Mechanus collector set review, a comparison between this Dalek and the original Sound Effects Wave Dalek is that we now have a change in the overall base colour. Of course, the initial Chase Guard Dalek that I can't show the comparison for at the minute is the regular 1960s base colour of silver that is seen on the vast majority of 60s Daleks, and of course this one is in fact a base colour of a silvery blue tint, very much like the Mechanus Daleks. Again, lovely, and sets this Dalek apart from the others on the shelf. You guessed it, at the very bottom of this Dalek we do have the inclusion of the slimmer fender. Again, very much like the first Dalek within this set, it's just been sculpted in a standard black plastic with no wash applied over the top of this. And then we move on to the hemispheres. Again, this has been rather sharply painted, seem to be an ever so slightly more vibrant darker blue. And then on this Dalek it does seem to be ever so slightly lighter, but this is something that really isn't that noticeable. Progressing further up the Dalek, once again we have the continuation of the silvery blue tint on the base colour, and much like the Mechanus Daleks we also have the use of the yellow, rather hazardous shade that has been used around the midsection. Again, this is very similar to the Jungles of Mechanus collector set and borderline identical. This is in fact different to the initial Chase Guard Dalek release, that was a kind of more bronzy shade. One of the biggest differences paint application wise to the Jungles of Mechanus collector set is that the blaster gun has now been painted the same shade as the base colour, being of course that silvery blue, compared to the initial Jungles of Mechanus collector set, which have the blaster guns being a standard silver. Much like the previous release, the ball joints have also been painted silver. And briefly talking about the manipulator arm, again, if you've got the Jungles of Mechanus collector set, this is exactly the same set of paint applications. The ball joint is silver, the vast majority of the stock itself has been painted the same silvery blue to the rest of the base colour of the Dalek, and just before the plunger we also have an ever so slight band of silver, and the actual plunger itself has been painted a glossy black. As for the top half of the Dalek, there really isn't that much to talk about. The barrel section is exactly the same to usual. The dome of the Dalek is ever so slightly different compared to the Jungles of Mechanus collector set, very much like how the hemispheres are. And as I mentioned earlier, the dome lights are also now that milky kind of cloudy colour. And as for the eye stalk itself, the base colour of this has been painted blue with the silver paint application on the stalk itself, and the discs are once again the spaced out design. This is an ever so slightly darker shade compared to the Jungles of Mechanus collector set. And finally, for the pupil at the tip, this is of course a black paint application on the base, as well as a small white dot at the end. And with that, that brings to an end my review of the history of the Dalek Set 3, exclusive to B&M, featuring 2 Dalek variations from the First Doctor 1965 serial, The Chase. Overall for this collector set, I think that it features 2 fairly nice variations of Dalek, and if you have the initial versions, then they are very, very similar, however do feature some fairly decent paint application changes. Same thing applies to this set that applies to all the other History of the Daleks collector sets. If you are currently struggling to keep up with all the B&M exclusive releases that have came out over the past few months, because there has been quite a lot of them, and you're kind of scared that some sets are going to sell out before others, perhaps you're wanting to focus on the more exciting variants, the likes of the Unit 1975 set, or even the companions of the 4th Doctor collector sets, then I think that the History of the Daleks sets should probably be low down on your list to purchase, because if you have the initial versions, then you aren't really getting too much from these sets. At the end of the day, the main reasons why these sets exist is either for the collectors who like to get every single Dalek variant to exist under the sun, for all those people who missed out on the original rarer Forbidden Planet exclusive releases and wish to build a Dalek army. So that said, this set isn't the most exciting, it's definitely not essential, it does feature 2 fairly decent variants with some interesting paint application changes. So thank you very much for watching this review, I hope you have enjoyed it. Do of course stay tuned on The Host Productions for brand new Doctor Who content each and every week, as well as of course future reviews as a part of the B&M exclusive series. Thanks once again for watching, and I shall see you all next time. Bye for now.